Summary of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Overview. In On the Road, 1957, Jack Kerouac takes readers across America and Mexico with Sal Paradise, a young writer from New Jersey who always dreamed of exploring the West. Fresh out of reform school, the mysterious and charismatic Dean Moriarty storms into Sal's life, marking the beginning of 3 years on the road. Through bus rides and hitchhiking, Sal's journey is packed with alcohol, sex, jazz, and madness as he follows Dean across the country. Kerouac's classic novel is both an ode to the Beat generation and a harbinger of the counterculture to come. The mysterious Dean Moriarty. Sal Paradise always dreamed about traveling to the West to see the country. He first met Dean Moriarty when he was depressed after divorcing his wife. Sal knew Dean through his friend Chad King, who showed him letters Dean had written from a New Mexico reform school. Dean was sent there after setting a Denver record for stealing cars. Sal always hoped to meet the mysterious Dean Moriarty. In the winter of 1947, Dean moved to New York with his wife, Mary Lou, after leaving reform school. He met Sal there and they drank and talked until dawn. However, Dean and Mary Lou had a fight shortly after, and she reported him to the police, so he had to leave New York. He went to New Jersey, where Sal lived with his aunt, and asked him to teach him how to write since he was a writer. Dean said he wanted to be a real intellectual, like Sal and his friends. Sal and Dean's conversations were always full of intellectual jargon that neither of them actually understood, but they understood each other's madness. Sal let Dean stay with him at his aunt's place until he found a job, and then they agreed to go out west together. Dean met Sal's friend Carlo Marx, and they quickly became close. They talked all day and night about their lives. Then spring arrived, and Dean left for Denver. Sal promised himself to follow Dean on his travels soon. He was drawn to Dean, not just because he was a writer in need of new experiences, but also because he felt like Dean was his long-lost brother. He liked him because, unlike all his intellectual friends, Dean was always eager and hungry for life. His intelligence was shining and complete without the tedious intellectualism. And so, in July 1947, Sal saved up $50 and headed to the West Coast. He ended up hitchhiking in circles because he didn't plan his journey well, and had to spend most of his money on a bus ticket to Chicago. The road to Denver. From Chicago, he hitchhiked to Davenport, Iowa, where he saw the Mississippi River for the first time. He caught a ride with a crazy truck driver who yelled a lot and told him stories. Sal ended up in Des Moines, where he spent the night in a cheap hotel room. When he woke up the next morning, he couldn't remember who he was for about 15 strange seconds. He wasn't scared, he just felt like he was somebody else now that he was far from home. Eager to meet up with all his friends who were already in Denver, Sal set off again. He met a drunk guy called Eddie, who was also heading to Denver, and they decided to hitchhike together through Iowa and Nebraska. However, in Shelton, Nebraska, an old man driving a trailer offered a ride to only one of them. Without a word, Eddie jumped in, and Sal was left alone, waiting for hours before he managed to catch a ride to the town of Gothenburg. This was where Sal caught the greatest ride of his life. It was a truck with a flatboard in the back, and 6 or 7 guys were splayed out on it. The drivers were 2 young farmers, and they were picking up every hitchhiker they found on the road. The hitchhikers were from all over the U.S., and were all headed to different places. There were 2 farm boys, some high school kids, and a man that Sal named Montana Slim. They talked and passed a bottle of whiskey around as they drove for hours. At one point, Montana Slim was trying to urinate over the side of the truck as they drove, and the drivers played a prank on him by zigzagging the truck, making him urinate all over himself. Everyone laughed, then they passed him the bottle to make up for it. They reached Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Sal and Montana Slim said goodbye to the others, and got off the truck to explore the Wild West Week celebrations in town. They hit the bars together. Sal had a little money left, and he spent all but $2 on drinks. They drank with 2 girls in a nightclub until it closed. Then they walked to the bus station, where Sal started to feel bad for spending all his money and for fooling around with those girls. Eventually, he fell asleep there and dreamed about his past life in the East. When he woke up, Montana Slim was gone. Sal was hungover, but after a few rides and a nap, he felt refreshed and continued on to Denver. He got off his last ride to Denver with the most devilish grin of glee in the world. Denver nights. Sal called his friend Chad to pick him up. Chad told him that their friend Tim Gray had set up an apartment for him, which he would share with their other friend, Roland Major. Ray Rollins, another friend, lived a few blocks away. Sal was excited to see Dean, but he didn't know how to find him. Sal spent 10 days partying in Denver before Carlo managed to contact him. Carlo told him that Dean was sleeping with 2 girls, Mary Lou and another girl called Camille. Neither of them was aware of this at the time, of course. Dean and Carlo had also embarked on a tremendous journey together. They were trying to communicate everything on their minds with absolute honesty, with the help of Benzedrine. They would sit cross-legged facing each other and talk all night in order to figure out Dean's life. Dean had a very tight schedule between the 2 women and Carlo. When they met, Dean was happy to see Sal, and told him that he had a girl for him named Rita Betancourt. They all went out together and had a big party that day. But eventually, Sal found himself alone in the street after spending his last dollar. He returned home and quickly fell asleep. Sal decided that he didn't need a job. He had a place to stay and free food. All he had to do was cook and wash the dishes for his roommate. He spent his days going to parties around the city and meeting his friends. One time, he attended one of Dean and Carlo's sessions at 3 a.m. Carlo showed him the journal where he recorded everything Dean said and did. Dean told them that he was going to get a divorce from Mary Lou, marry Camille, and move to San Francisco with her after going to Texas with Carlo. Sal listened to his friends talk all night. They were amazing maniacs. Sal then visited the mountains in Central City, Colorado, for the weekend with Tim, Roland, and Ray. They were staying in an old shack that they cleaned out. They threw a party there and danced the night away. Then they decided to hit the bars, but they were kicked out after Ray got into a fight. Eventually, they staggered back to the shack and fell asleep. On the ride back to Denver, Sal decided he wanted to go to San Francisco. Back in Denver, Sal called Carlo only to find out he and Dean were in Central City the whole time. Sal told him he was leaving for San Francisco. He met with Rita, and they went back to his apartment. They slept together, but she was afraid of sex, so it was awkward. He spent the following 2 days walking around, saying goodbye to his friends, and making plans to all meet up in San Francisco. He received some money that his aunt sent him, bought a bus ticket, and left. Trouble in San Francisco. Sal arrived at his friend Remy Bonker's place in Mill City, a shack in a housing project outside of San Francisco that was said to be the only community in America where whites and blacks lived together voluntarily. Sal and Remy met in prep school, but Sal's former wife was the thing that really tied them together. Remy found her first, but then she left him for Sal. Remy never blamed him for it, though. He let him stay at his place after making him promise not to touch his girl, Lee Ann. Sal then decided he needed a job, so Remy arranged for them to work together as guards in the shipyard barracks, which were temporary quarters for overseas construction workers waiting for their ships. Sal had to work with a horrible group of officers. The others had cop souls and actually wanted to make arrests, while Remy and Sal were only trying to make a living. One night, some sailors were having a party before their ship left the next morning. Sal tried to keep order in the noisy barracks, but ended up getting drunk with them, and then raising the American flag upside down the next morning, which almost sent him to jail. Sal and Remy often visited San Francisco looking for a girl for Sal, but they were unsuccessful. Lee Ann and Remy started fighting frequently. Everything collapsed between Remy, Lee Ann, and Sal when one day, Remy and Sal went to the racetrack and lost all their money. They all had a huge fight and didn't want anything to do with each other. However, Remy requested one final favor from them. He wanted them to help him make a good impression on his stepfather, who was visiting him soon. They agreed. But then, the day the stepfather arrived, Sal ran into Roland, and they got drunk and ended up embarrassing Remy. It took years for Remy to forgive him. Sal left Mill City and headed to LA. On the way there, he met a Mexican girl named Terry, who was also heading to LA. They talked, and he found out she was running away from an abusive husband. They hit it off immediately. He said he loved her and took her to a hotel room, where they got drunk before making love and falling asleep. Sal and Terry decided to go to New York together, but first they needed money for the trip. They spent a few days looking for work but had no luck, so they decided to hitchhike instead. However, all the cars were full of high school kids who made fun of them as they passed. They wandered along the highway ditches and eventually found a motel to spend the night in. In the morning, they headed to Bakersfield with the plan to pick grapes for money, but they had no luck finding jobs. Terry then had the idea to hitchhike to her hometown, Sabinal, and live in her brother's garage until they found work. They ended up driving around with her brother Ricky until Sal got a job picking cotton. He worked all day from dawn to sundown and spent the night in a tent with her. He earned $1.50 each day, which was just enough for food. As the days went by, Sal almost forgot about the East and his friends. But eventually October came, and they were forced to leave because of the cold. Sal and Terry said goodbye, and she went back to her family, who were not happy to see her but allowed her to stay. Sal then went to the telegraph office to pick up more money that his aunt had sent him. Then he set off for the city. He took a ride to Hollywood and then bought a bus ticket to Pittsburgh, because he could not afford to travel all the way to New York. He continued hitching rides until he finally reached New York. Then he realized he had no money left for the bus ride to New Jersey. He had to panhandle for a quarter before jumping on the bus to his aunt's place. She was happy to see him. He had made it home just in time before winter set in. Dean had visited his aunts looking for him and stayed for a while. But he had left for San Francisco, where Camille had found an apartment only 2 nights before. Another spurt around the road. It was a year before Sal saw Dean again, though he had been sending him letters. Sal had been staying at home writing his book. At Christmas 1948, Sal and his aunt were visiting his brother Rocco in Virginia, when Dean suddenly showed up in a new 49 Hudson with Mary Lou and their friend Ed Dunkel. Dean then volunteered to help Sal's relatives move their furniture to their new place in New Jersey. Ed and Dean had been working on the railroad, earning $400 per month until they were laid off because of a drastic reduction in crews. Dean had been living happily with Camille in San Francisco, and they had a daughter named Amy. But then he decided to head to New York to bring Sal back on the road. He had spent all his cash on the car and was now out of money. Ed met a girl named Galatea, who agreed to pay for their trip, but only after he married her. They hit the road and then left her in a hotel in Tucson when her money ran out. Dean then had an explosive yen to see Mary Lou again and zoomed into Denver to pick her up. Sal's relatives were not impressed by Dean's madness. Sal had been enjoying a quiet Christmas, but with Dean's return, he was back on the road again. They packed Sal's relatives' furniture and hit the road. When they reached his aunt's house to spend the night, Sal received a call from Galatea. She was in New Orleans with their friend Old Bull Lee and was looking for Ed. Sal assured her they would pick her up on their way back to the coast. After that, they met up with Carlo, who had quieted down since the Denver days. He had gone on a trip to Dakar that changed him. They said goodbye to Carlo and headed back to Virginia to bring the rest of the furniture and Sal's aunt. During that trip, Dean was excited and talked a lot. He had become a mystic, much to Sal's surprise. He talked about his belief in God and how everything would work out. Most of the things he said were nonsense, but somehow Sal understood. Old Bull Lee. Sal started planning a trip to the West Coast with Dean. He wanted to go with Dean because he always wanted to know what he would do next. He also wanted to have an affair with Mary Lou when Dean got back to Camille. In the days before they left, Carlos started giving them semi-ironical speeches, trying to get them to think about what they were doing to their lives and their women. His speeches were only met with giggles. One night, Dean asked Sal to sleep with Mary Lou so that he could see what she was like with another man. Sal got in bed with Mary Lou while Dean watched, but then he said he couldn't do it because his heart wasn't in it. He wanted to wait until they became lovers when they reached San Francisco. Sal bade his aunt farewell the next day, vowing to return in 2 weeks. The gang then traveled to California. Back on the road, they discussed how there was no need to ever worry about anything, and that they should all focus on enjoying themselves. They listened to music and enjoyed the scenery. Dean and Mary Lou started planning how they were going to meet behind Camille's back, and Sal knew then that he would be left alone in San Francisco while Dean and Mary Lou stayed together. They were driving to Washington, D.C., when they were pulled over. The police officers questioned them and eventually fined Dean $25. Sal thought the police seemed more interested in harassing them than anything else. The group only had $15 left to reach San Francisco, so they had to pick up hitchhikers and take quarters from them for gas. Dean also stole gas and cigarettes along the way. They reached New Orleans and went to their friend Old Bull Lee's house, where Galatea was waiting for them. Old Bull Lee was a teacher who spent all his time learning. He was also a drug addict who held some odd jobs in the past, like when he worked as an exterminator in Chicago or a bartender in New York. He sat at café tables in Paris and observed the glum French people go by. He did all of this for the sake of experience. Bull Lee took the group out to bars, even though he thought bars were dull places. There, he confided in Sal that he thought that Dean had gotten worse and was headed for a life of violence and psychosis. He was worried about Sal going to California with Dean. He believed Dean was a madman. They spent the next day talking with Bull and running around New Orleans. Bull showed Sal how to disarm someone in his backyard, and Dean taught him how to jump off a moving train. Ed and Galatea stayed in New Orleans. At dusk, Dean, Sal, and Mary Lou said goodbye to everyone and were off to California. Dean the Selfish. They drove on, only stopping to steal gas, food, and cigarettes. They stopped once near Ozona when Dean decided to take all his clothes off and run naked through the sagebrush. He told Sal and Mary Lou to take their clothes off too, and the three of them sat in the front seat of the car naked as they drove on. They eventually arrived in El Paso and found a place to stay for the night. They continued on to Bakersfield, picking up hitchhikers for gas money. When they finally reached San Francisco, Dean dropped Mary Lou and Sal off and told them to find a hotel before he left to find Camille. With no money, they were stuck on the street. Mary Lou was angry and called Dean a bastard. Mary Lou knew some people around the area, and they ended up staying in a hotel room on credit. The next day, Mary Lou ditched Sal for a nightclub owner, and Sal saw what a whore she was. He had nothing and nobody. He walked around San Francisco, picking up cigarette butts. Sal then had a strange feeling as he passed a store proprietress. He believed that she was his disapproving mother from a past life. There was a moment of ecstasy in which he realized that he had probably died and been reborn numberless times. He felt a deep sense of bliss and peace, and thought he was going to die the very next moment, but then he made it back to his room. Later, Dean found Sal and brought him to Camille's house. Dean had found a job as a salesman for a new kind of pressure cooker. He was a hurricane of energy at first, but his energy ran out quickly, and he gave up on the job. Sal and Dean were sick and tired of everything. One night, however, they went mad again, when they went to see a show by a jazz musician called Slim Gaillard. Slim always did and said anything that came into his head. He'd perform an upbeat song, then abruptly slow it down, as everyone leaned forward eagerly to listen. Sal and Dean goofed around San Francisco until Sal decided to go back home. Sal wasn't sure what he had accomplished on this trip, but he wanted to get out. At dawn, he said goodbye to Dean and Mary Lou and got on a bus to New York. It was a sad goodbye. They were so done with each other that they thought they'd never meet again, but still they didn't care. On the road again. In the spring of 1949, Sal moved to Denver, thinking of settling down there. However, he felt lonely and displaced since none of his friends were there. He walked around the streets alone, thinking of Dean and Mary Lou and longing for their company. One day, he visited a rich girl he knew, and she gave him money to go to San Francisco. When he got there, he immediately ran to Dean's place. Sal was dying to hear what was on his mind. Sal knocked on his door at 2 a.m. Dean was happy to see him. They talked about Dean's recent problems with his wife. Camille had been throwing tantrums about Dean's behavior. Dean was worried she was going mad. Camille wasn't happy with Sal's arrival either. Dean had begun to settle down, but now that Sal was there, Camille knew that the madness would take over Dean again. After Sal left San Francisco the year before, Dean went crazy over Mary Lou and spent months trailing her around town. She was sleeping around with a lot of men. Dean then smoked a lot of marijuana and had the most intense trip of his life. He felt like he understood everything and saw some incredible visions. But then he started having nightmares. He became so agitated that he ran to Mary Lou with a gun and told her that one of them had to die. Mary Lou talked him out of it, and he was glad that she did. Mary Lou then married a used car dealer who threatened to kill Dean if he went near her. But Dean still went after Mary Lou and hurt his thumb trying to hit her. He ended up with a chronic bone infection that required the amputation of part of his thumb. He was always in pain from his injury and had a lot of medical appointments, so he was now taking care of their baby daughter while Camille worked. They also had a second baby on the way. The next day, Sal and Dean invited some friends over, and Camille was upset that they were disrupting her life again. They had a fight, and she threw them all out of the house. On the street with their luggage, Sal asked Dean to come with him to New York and then to Italy. He was getting $1,000 from publishing his book. Dean realized then for the first time how much Sal cared about him. They both knew that they had always shared a common fate. They went to a bar after that and agreed to stick together no matter what. They went to San Francisco for 2 days of fun before heading east. They met up with Galatea, who told them that she had broken up with Ed. Galatea was angry with Dean for the way he was treating Camille and his daughter. She said he was being selfish by leaving them to travel with Sal. She started berating him like he was her errant child, but Dean didn't care. Sal defended Dean, saying that he was a good person despite his flaws. But she objected, saying that he didn't know Dean well. She believed he was the worst con man who ever lived, which amused Sal. He was the only one who didn't fear Dean. Dean and Sal spent the ride to Denver talking. Sal felt like he had never talked so much in all his life. They spoke about jazz and told stories of their childhood. On the way home. In Denver, Dean was excited to meet his cousin Sam Brady at a bar. He told Sal that Sam was his hero when they were growing up, and that he was the only family member who cared about him. However, when Sam arrived, he told Dean that he only came to see him because he wanted him to sign a paper that cut him out of the family's will. He didn't want anything to do with Dean. Afterward, Sal told Dean that he believed in him, and that he was sorry that nobody else did. Dean started stealing cars in Denver, and almost got arrested because the police had his fingerprints from the year that he stole 500 cars before being sent to reform school. They had to leave immediately. They went to a travel agency and met a man who needed someone to drive his Cadillac limo to Chicago. Soon they were on the road. Dean was driving over 110 miles per hour and ended up breaking the speedometer. Dean drove so recklessly that Sal gave up and laid down in the back seat, exhausted. They were in a minor accident, but they still arrived in Chicago in 17 hours, which they believed was a crazy record. When they arrived in Chicago, they were immediately impressed by the city and started to explore. They went to jazz clubs and followed the musicians around different bars. They listened to them play until 9 in the morning. After that, Dean and Sal returned the Cadillac to the owner and left quickly before he complained about the condition of the car. They took a bus to Detroit after that. There, they decided to stay up all night in an all-night movie theater and watch a movie about a singing cowboy and another one about Istanbul. They saw the movies 6 times each that day. Then they went to a travel agency where they found a man who charged them $4 each for the ride to New York. They got to New York in the early morning and went to Sal's aunt's new flat on Long Island. The trip was over. They took a walk that night and clasped hands, agreeing to be friends forever. 5 nights later, they were at a party in New York when they met a girl named Inez, whom Dean instantly wanted to marry. A few days later, he was calling Camille in San Francisco to discuss divorce. Camille gave birth to Dean's second child a few months later, and Inez followed suit within months. And with another illegitimate child somewhere in the West, Dean had 4 kids now and no money at all. And so they never went to Italy. The final trip. In the spring of 1950, Sal got some money from selling his book and decided to travel again. This time, he left Dean in New York and went alone. Dean had a job at a parking lot to support his children. He was sad to be left in New York without his friend. They spent the day together talking about their lives and how they were growing older. Sal expressed his hope that one day they would live on the same street with their families and grow old together. Then they said their goodbyes, and Sal hit the road alone. Sal went to Denver, where he met up with his friends Tim Gray and Stan Shepard. They spent their afternoons in Denver bars, and their nights listening to jazz and drinking. Sal and Stan were preparing to go to Mexico together when they received news that Dean had bought a car and was going to join them in Denver. They were unsure of what to expect from Dean's arrival. Sal knew that Dean had gone mad again. He was worried about the children Dean would be leaving behind with no money now that he had spent all his savings on a car. Dean arrived and explained that he was joining them on the trip to get a Mexican divorce from Camille, which was cheaper and quicker. They all had a party at a friend's house that night. They were so wasted that Sal fractured a bone in his finger and didn't even notice it until the following day. In the morning, Sal, Dean, and Stan said goodbye to their friends and set out for Mexico. A bug bit Stan during the trip, and his arm began to swell. Dean and Sal decided to wait and see if the swelling went down before heading to the hospital. They drove through Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas before stopping in San Antonio. They stopped at a gas station and took Stan to a hospital clinic, where he got a shot of penicillin. They explored the streets for a few hours before driving on to Mexico. They crossed the border into Mexico and were amazed by how different it looked from the U.S. Sal and Dean couldn't stop staring at the men in straw hats who were lounging in front of broken-down stores. They were also struck by the difference in the way the Mexican officials treated them. The officials were lazy and tender, and they grinned at them. They changed their money into pesos and stuffed them in their pockets with delight. They were amazed by how far their money went. They stopped in the town of Gregoria and met a boy named Victor, who promised to get them some girls later that night. He also gave them weed. They got so high that Sal started hallucinating. He believed that Dean looked like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but then decided that he looked like God. After that, Victor took them to a whorehouse where they spent 3 wild hours. There, they were introduced to a group of girls dancing and were instantly drawn to them. The proprietor put on music over the loudspeaker. It was so loud that it shook the building and attracted a crowd of people from the town, who stood outside to watch the Americans dance frantically and throw their money at the girls. Victor suddenly showed them the bill. It was more than 300 pesos, or $36, but they couldn't stop drinking and didn't want to go. Eventually, Sal and Dean dragged Stan out and said goodbye to the girls in the crowd. They entered the jungle outside Gregoria and were amazed by the scenery and the number of insects. They pulled over in a town called Limon and slept in the car. Then they drove on through Mexico until they came across some mountains, and Dean wanted to stop to take it all in. They saw some Indian people along the road, and Dean was amazed by them. He gave an Indian girl his wristwatch, and she whimpered with joy as a crowd of children watched with amazement. Dean appeared to Sal to be the prophet who had come to save them. They watched him with serious and insane eyes. Sal got dysentery and became delirious with a fever for a few days. When he woke up one time, Dean told him that he had gotten his divorce from Camille and was leaving for New York without him and Stan. Sal realized what a rat Dean was after he recovered, but then he comprehended the unimaginable complexities of Dean's life. He had to leave him there to get on with his wives and woes, so Sal let it go. The end of the road. When Dean reached New York, he and Inez immediately got married. But then one day he left for San Francisco to live with Camille and his 2 daughters. Later, he wanted to bring Inez to San Francisco with him and Camille, but she refused and didn't want anything to do with him. Dean's life settled with Camille. In the fall, Sal returned home from Mexico. One night, he met a girl in Manhattan named Laura, and they immediately agreed to love each other madly. Dean came to New York one day. Sal never understood why he had come, except to see him. This was also when Remy came to New York to take Sal and Laura to a concert at the Metropolitan Opera. Remy met Dean then, but he never liked him. Dean was preparing to leave New York for San Francisco for the last time, and wanted Remy to drop him off at the train station. But Remy would not have it. Sal and Dean said goodbye before Sal got in the car with Remy and Laura to go to the concert. And that was the last time Sal saw Dean. About the author. Jack Kerouac received a football scholarship to Columbia University, but he quit the team and dropped out of college after just 1 year. He turned to writing, releasing his first novel, Town and City, in 1950. Kerouac then went on a trip across the country with his friends, which inspired his greatest book, On the Road. He wrote it in just 3 weeks, on a 120-foot single scroll of paper. The character of Dean was inspired by Neal Cassady, an iconic figure in both the Beat generation and the counterculture. We hope you enjoyed summary of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Purchase the book to learn more.